Take a look at the map. Coffee is not supposed to belong here. This is a country shaped by tea, by its age-old rituals, by silence turned into ceremony, by patience refined into philosophy, if you will. And yet walk through Tokyo and you'll see people lining up quietly for coffee. Not rushing, but waiting. Japan didn't quite adapt coffee like the rest of the world, if you will, because it reinterpreted it. And to understand how that happened, why a bitter foreign drink took root in a culture already saturated with tradition, you have to understand something most coffee stories entirely skip. You have to understand the politics. For most of its history, Japan made a deliberate choice not to exist in the world's imagination. The Tokugawa shogunate's policy of Sakoku, roughly translated as closed country, wasn't just a trade restriction, it was a philosophy of the government. The idea was simple and radical. If you control what enters, you control what changes. For over 200 years, from the early 1600s to the mid 1800s, Japan sealed itself off from the world with a precision that had few parallels in modern history. Foreign goods were restricted. Foreign religion was punishable by death. Foreign ideas were treated with the same paranoia as foreign armies. Tea, of course, was already there. It had been there for centuries. It was woven into everything. Ceremony, architecture, social hierarchy, the philosophy of wabi-sabi, everything. It wasn't just a drink, it was a worldview in a liquid form. Coffee had no way in there. The first encounter came through a narrow crack in the wall, Dejima, a small artificial island in Nagasaki harbor where Dutch traders were permitted to operate under suffocating restrictions. Coffee arrived there not as a pleasure but as curiosity, a bitter Western liquid that outsiders drank. There was no ceremony around it, no social need for it, no argument for its existence inside a culture that already had its drink and its rituals. Nobody was rushing to adopt it. Then came 1853. American warships entered Edo Bay and Japan's 2 centuries of isolation ended. And the country that emerged from that rupture made a decision that would shape everything that followed. If we open, we will control how we open. The Meiji restoration was not a surrender, but it was a most deliberate modernization project of the 19th century. Railways, factories, legal systems, military infrastructure, Western dresses, all of it imported selectively, analyzed and disciplined into something Japanese. The government sent students abroad not to be absorbed by other cultures, but to extract what was useful and bring it home on Japanese terms. Coffee followed the same logic. It didn't arrive as a communal drink or a symbol of liberation. It arrived as a tool, something the modern, urbanized Japanese city might need. Filtering through the same lens that filtered everything else entering the country. The first cafes that emerged in Meiji-era cities were Kissaten, dim, quiet rooms where time slowed deliberately, where you could sit alone without being questioned. Not European coffee houses, not loud spaces to debate and make arguments, but something quieter, something with borders. The difference is not incidental. European cafe houses in the 17th centuries were engines of political ferment. Lloyd's of London began as one. The French Revolution arguably brewed in them. Japan looked at that model and built something that looked similar from the outside, but functions entirely different from the inside. In Europe, coffee houses were built for arguments. In Japan, they were built for containment. And that distinction would prove to be the whole story here. To understand why Kissaten exploded across Japan in the decades after World War II, you need to understand how Japan looked like in August of 1945. 67 cities were firebombed. Tokyo had been flattened more thoroughly by the incendiaries than Hiroshima was by atom bombs. Between 3 and 4 million Japanese people were dead. The economy had collapsed to near zero. American occupation forces arrived and began rewriting the country, its constitution, its military structure, the land reform policies, its educational philosophy, its industrial architecture. What doesn't get said enough is that Japan's post-war economic recovery was not an accident of culture. It was a political project. The Liberal Democratic Party, which came to power in 1955 and would hold it for almost the rest of the century, made a bargain with the Japanese people that was never written down but understood by everyone. We deliver growth, you provide stability. No revolution, no strikes, no political disruption, and in exchange, rising wages, job security, and a growing consumer class. A country that would become within a single generation one of the wealthiest on earth. By 1960, Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato had put a number to that promise. His income doubling plan committed to doubling household incomes within a decade. In concrete terms, this meant something the Japanese people had not been experiencing in their living memory: disposable income. The three sacred imperial treasures, if you will, the mirror, the sword, and the jewel, were quietly replaced by a new set of objects: the refrigerator, the washing machine, and the television. This became the symbol of middle-class arrival, the items that signified that you have crossed the threshold from survival to prosperity. The government wasn't just growing the economy, it was engineering a consumer class and telling that class what it was supposed to want. Into this, coffee arrived precisely on time. A cup at a Kissaten in 1965 Tokyo cost roughly 100 yens, and that was real money, roughly equivalent to a modest street meal. The yen was fixed at 360 to the dollar by the Dodge line of the 1949 at a rate designed to make Japanese exports competitive on world market. The side effect was the imported goods carried a dollar inflated cost. Coffee with raw materials priced in the international market was aspirational. It was one of those mindlessly expensive foreign things that the newly minted middle class could now afford. To drink coffee in Kissaten in the 1960s was, in some quiet and largely unconscious way, was to practice being the person the Japanese economy miracle was trying to produce. You ordered something that wasn't cheap, you sat somewhere considered, you occupied time not as a laborer surviving reconstruction, but as a person with enough to spare, enough money, enough time, enough ease to simply sit. And that was its own kind of statement. The salaryman, that peculiar Japanese figure who gave his entire waking life to a corporation in exchange for a lifetime of employment and a pension, found in a Kissaten something that office couldn't provide. Neutral ground. You might be a junior clerk, the man next to you might be the department head. Inside the Kissaten, neither of you were required to perform your rank. You were just two people with coffee and time. In a country that organized itself with almost unprecedented discipline around productivity and hierarchy, that silence was quietly radical. Here's what's strange about the Kissaten. It became more intentional as Japan became more efficient. You'd expect the opposite. As the economy accelerated through the 60s and 70s, factories running at full capacity, export numbers climbing, Tokyo reshaping itself from the rumble into one of the densest and fastest cities on earth, you'd expect that the spaces where people rested to get faster as well. But instead, Kissaten went to the other direction. Beans were selected with the specificity that bordered on obsession. Siphon brewers and cloth drippers replaced simple methods. The barista, though nobody called them that, studied their craft for years, sometimes decades, before they considered themselves finished and masters. The goal was not a good cup, it was the same cup perfectly reproduced every single time. This precision had a cultural name in Japan: shokunin. The word is usually translated as craftsman, but though the translation loses something, a shokunin is not just skill. A shokunin is committed to mastery in a way that makes novelty suspicious. The French chef would reinvent himself every season is kind of exciting, if you will, but the Kissaten owner who has served the same single origin bean brewed in same way for 40 years is revered. No refills, no customization, no noise beyond what the owner decided to play. Usually jazz or classical, carefully chosen records on expensive audio equipment, music that asks nothing of you. You sat with your cup and you were, for however long, accountable to nothing. The brewing methods made this tangible. A slow pour, visible process. These weren't just techniques, they were a physical argument that time here belonged to the person sitting and not to the clock. This is the Japanese concept of ma at work. The meaningful interval, the pause that gives form to what surrounds it. Without ma, the notes are just noise. Without ma, the room is just furniture. The Kissaten was ma made into business model. Now, if you look into it, they didn't really sell coffee. It sold permission to stop. And the economic miracle, all that growth, all the discipline, pressure to produce and consume and rise, made that permission feel necessary. You couldn't keep running at the pace Japan was running without something being still. The Kissaten was where the machine's exhaust went. By the early 1970s, something odd was happening across Japanese cities. Vending machines were multiplying on nearly every block, and many of them were serving coffee. Hot cans in winter, cold in summer, black, sweet, with milk, canned lattes, whatever you can think of. Entire flavor of ecosystem engineered for consumption in under 30 seconds. At any hour without single word exchange with another human. By the end of the decade, Japan would have more vending machines per capita than any other country on earth. The coffee they served was warm, cheap, and available at 3 in the morning under a flickering streetlight. This looks on the surface like the death of everything that the Kissaten stood for. But it wasn't. What Japan figured out, and this is genuinely unusual in the history of consumer culture, is that you can separate function from its meaning if you're disciplined about keeping them apart. Vending machine coffee solved a specific problem. The body needs caffeine and it needs it now. There is no time. And this is the logistical problem, and it deserves a logistical solution. The Kissaten was never solving that problem. It was solving a completely different problem entirely. Many cultures fail to make this distinction. The efficient version of a thing tends to colonize the meaningful version. Drive-thrus replaces dinners, streaming replaces cinema, the first option wins because it's faster and the faster compounds. Japan managed not to let that happen with coffee. Partly because the Kissaten had been given by the same post-war political economy that created the salaryman and the consumer class, a function that efficiency couldn't replicate, a place to put the human cost of the miracle. The vending machine absorbed urgency, the Kissaten absorbed meaning. Neither was asked to do the other's job. When Starbucks arrived in Tokyo in 1996, the same logic held. Japan didn't reject it, but it didn't surrender to it either. The chain cafes filled a third category, the transitional space between work and home, designed for laptop meetings and scheduled catch-ups. Not for stillness. Kissaten remained elsewhere, doing something else. The country didn't choose between these three coffee cultures, it kept all three and let each one do its specific job. That coexistence didn't happen by accident. It required a culture that had spent over a century learning to adapt foreign things on its own terms, absorbing what was useful, disciplining it, and refusing to let it override what's already there. The simple political logic that turned post-war Japan into the export powerhouse that it is, that insistence on controlled adaptation, on importing the tool without importing the value system attached to it, turned out to be exactly what kept the Kissaten alive inside the most efficient consumer society on earth. That logic hasn't disappeared. Many Kissaten have closed now. The owners have spent decades perfecting a single cup, have retired, and the culture that formed around them has thinned. But what they represented, the idea that stillness is worth protecting, that some spaces should actively resist the pressure to be faster and louder and more efficient, runs through Japanese coffee culture still. You can see it in a third wave specialty cafes that have proliferated across Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka over the last 2 decades. The equipment is different, the aesthetics is younger, but the underlying insistence is the same. Slow down, pay attention. The cup in front of you is worth the time you're giving it. Japan didn't adopt coffee because it needed a new drink. Tea was already there. Tea was, by any measure, better suited for that culture. Native, ceremonial, philosophically integrated. The decision to let coffee in and to let it stay, and to build an entire philosophy around the space where it was served, was a response to something much larger: the question of how a society modernizes without losing itself. The Meiji government asked the question in the 1870s, looking at Western warships and deciding they needed railways and constitutions but not Christianity. The LDP technocrats asked it again in the 1960s, designing an economic miracle that promised prosperity without revolution. The Kissaten owners, probably without thinking of it in those terms, answered it every single day by insisting that even inside an economic miracle, in a culture of relentless productivity and upward motion and nation's ambition, there should be a room somewhere that refuses to move. Coffee in Japan was never about energy, it was about permission. Permission to be still, to be alone, to be temporarily unavailable. In a culture that made all three of those things difficult to justify through any other means. The cup in front of you was a proof that you had a reason to be there, and the rest was yours. That refusal was never ideological. It didn't announce itself. Nobody put a sign in the window. It was just a room and a cup and a door that closed out the street. But over decades, across hundreds and thousands of these rooms, it accumulated into something, a counter-argument embedded in the architecture of daily life. A reminder served quietly and repeatedly that speed is a means and not an end. That the point of building a country is not building itself, it is what you get to do once it's built. The room served coffee, and it still does.